So let's talk about Social Security today. A few months ago, it was reported on CNBC that the Social Security Trust Fund's depletion date moves up 1 year earlier to 2034, Treasury says. It's from March 31st, and as you can see, one of the bullet points says, if unaddressed at that time in 2034, the program will be unable to pay 80% of scheduled benefits.
Uh-oh, SpaghettiOs!
And what got me thinking more about this topic recently was former Vice President Mike Pence making a big deal about this. Just the other day on May 16th, Mike Pence said, today, one of the biggest drivers of runaway spending is so-called entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, which make up more than 70% of our national budget. Medicare has 5 years before it's insolvent. Social Security has 10 years, if we're lucky. Pence goes on to say, once we reach the point of insolvency, Social Security and Medicare will be slashed across the board, regardless of need or income, leaving seniors scrambling to find the money to pay for rent, groceries, and medicine. Going on to say, ignoring the problem is no longer an option. Joe Biden's policy is insolvency. Sadly, so is President Trump's. And the same can be said of any candidate unwilling to talk about the urgent need to save Social Security before it collapses. And I have a lot to say about that, but first I thought we could talk about the history of Social Security, starting with the lead up to it. I read a couple articles. This one is from the Social Security Administration website. There's another article that's similar to this on the History Channel's website, as you can see. And one of the messages, one of the lessons I took from reading these articles is that this whole debate, this whole discussion, even going all the way back to pre-Great Depression times, I think it's worth noting that the debate over retirement savings and retirement plans, the desire for retirement plans, including government-mandated retirement plans, I think this is a good problem to have. What do I mean by that? Well, if you read the article put out by the Social Security Administration, along with the History Channel article, a reason why people started thinking about this issue, about Social Security, private pensions, government-mandated pension plans, and whatnot, was because thanks to industrialization and innovation and the massive wealth creation that America saw between the 19th and early 20th centuries, Americans were living longer lives. A lot of Americans were living a lot longer. At least to the point where they would become unable to work and support themselves. And looking back, I think it's astonishing the conclusions that were drawn from this phenomenon, because the fact that the masses, that Americans were living longer lives, I mean, that should be celebrated. That should be looked at as a wonderful achievement, a sign of progress. And I guess the people of the time, at least by the 1930s, even prior to that, were looking at this and saying, whoa, this is wonderful. And the conclusion they drew was, obviously, that the government then has to, what? Take money from people's paychecks?
Oh, you absolutely suck!
Astonishing logic, folks. But as the Social Security Administration and the History Channel insist, another factor that played into this was the migration from farms to cities, the migration of workers from farms to cities, the migration from subsistence farming to industrial work, from subsistence farming to wage work. And I guess a consequence of this was the erosion of the extended family, because I guess prior to the migration, it used to be the case that if someone were lucky enough to reach the point where they could not work to support themselves, then extended family, extended relatives would step in and pick up the slack, so to speak. They would assume responsibility. And I guess the move from the farms to the cities sort of eroded that connection. Although Don Watkins explains why this notion was overblown in his book, Roosevelt Care.
Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book. Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book.
Don Watkins says, remarking on the life in the cities in the era between the Civil War and World War I, historian Walter Tratner, himself a supporter of the entitlement state, notes that the vast majority of those in need were able to rely on family, kin, and neighbors for aid, including the landlord who sometimes deferred rent, the local butcher or grocer who frequently carried them for a while by allowing bills to go unpaid, and the local saloon keeper who often came to their aid by providing loans and outright gifts, including free meals and, on occasion, temporary jobs. And going back to the Social Security Administration and History Channel articles, a lot of people do talk as if another factor was the Great Depression, this notion that, well, the Great Depression just sort of happened. And then suddenly a lot of elderly folks, a lot of elderly Americans were down on their luck, had trouble getting by. But even Don Watkins explains, he goes on to talk about how during the Great Depression, while it was painful for a lot of Americans, many Americans were able to manage, saying that, as historian Clarence Carson points out, most peoples of the world, if placed in the United States in the 1930s, would have been struck rather by prosperity than poverty. Going on to say this was not a decade filled with masses of starving Americans and justifying a radical departure from the principles of the founders. It was a rocky decade, very painful for some, anxiety tinged for many, but manageable for most. And as Watkins also talks about in this book, the foundations for the welfare state, including Social Security, were laid during the Progressive Era by goons like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, decades before the Great Depression, as well as progressive intellectuals. They helped lay the foundations. And between the Progressive Era and the Great Depression, discussion over state-mandated retirement savings were being discussed and well underway. So yeah, it's not like the Great Depression just happened and people suddenly started talking about government-mandated pension plans. And it's also worth noting that if not for the government intervention attempts by the Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt administrations, the Great Depression would have been far less severe. One thing I find interesting is how Social Security was initially presented versus what it eventually became, because it was really a giant Trojan horse. It was a means of opening the door for the welfare state. The welfare state is focused on a demographic that seemingly could not help themselves, take care of themselves, in this case the elderly, but they also managed to appeal to the American spirit of self-reliance and personal responsibility. As Watkins explains throughout this book, the New Dealers framed Social Security not as welfare or a handout, but rather as insurance, saying that the government, they're just taking a little bit of money from your paycheck, and by the time you're ready to retire, guess what? You're going to get all of that money back. And I've heard over the years a few times from economics types that if we let Americans, if the government let Americans keep more of their money, especially with the Social Security taxes, if Americans invested the money that's taken out of their paychecks for Social Security, if they invested that into a private retirement account for 50 years, then they would receive much more in retirement than what's currently given out from Social Security. And some estimate that to be as high as 3 times as much. And maybe there's a lot of truth to that, but I think it's worth noting that this debate is, again, not about economics. As Watkins talks about throughout this book, the New Dealers and the progressives invoked the language of morality. It's the right thing to do, to raise everyone's taxes by a little bit so that we can take care of those who really need help. Franklin Delano Roosevelt even admitted as much, saying, "We put those payroll contributions there so as to give the contributors a legal, moral, and political right to collect their pensions and their unemployment benefits. With those taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program. Those taxes are not a matter of economics, they're straight politics." And I remember this even being mentioned, this quote being mentioned in Burton Folsom's book, New Deal or Raw Deal, which also talks a lot about Social Security. And on top of all of that, as Watkins asserts later in the book, Social Security was mostly meant to be a floor protection, or at least that's how it was presented. It was meant to be supplemented by private savings and private pensions, adding that the entitlement status had bigger plans beyond this. Another consequence of Social Security was this eventually got taken to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court would eventually reinterpret the General Welfare Clause, which essentially gave Congress a blank check to redistribute wealth. Social Security should have been seen for the scam that it was from the start, considering that some of the first beneficiaries received way more money than they ever paid in after only paying in for only a couple of years. And even after that, Social Security expanded right away as soon as 1939, and even after that, politicians would continue to look for precious pressure groups to take care of. And it was not a hard sell after that, especially in the beginning when the workforce far outweighed the retired populations and other beneficiaries. During these times, during the early days of Social Security, the welfare state sounded like a good deal. For just a low cost of some relatively minuscule income taxes on workers, the country, the government, could take care of a lot of people in need. According to Watkins, in the earliest days of Social Security, there had been 40 workers for every retiree. By 1950, that ratio had dwindled to a still impressive 16.5 to 1. But by the 1970s, there were only 3.3 workers to carry the burden for every retiree. On top of finding more and more people to take care of and constantly increasing benefits, as we know, the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration would eventually pass Medicare and Medicaid. Even Richard Nixon, Republican Richard Nixon, would also increase retirement benefits, which, coupled with stagflation in the 1970s, led to an insolvency crisis with Social Security. And what happened after the 1970s? How was the insolvency crisis with Social Security fixed? Well, thankfully, after the 1970s, America got a free market president by the name of Ronald Reagan, who was able to articulate to the American people why and how Social Security was immoral, un-American, and unsustainable before presenting a coherent plan to transition out of the Social Security system. And things have been hunky-dory ever since. Oh, actually, wait, no. Ronald Reagan promised to preserve Social Security, hailing Social Security as a wonderful American achievement, which Ronald Reagan managed to preserve by making adjustments to the program, thereby prolonging the life of Social Security. And even after that, Bill Clinton in 1998 would eventually note how politicians need to start seriously thinking about Social Security, despite the fact that the program was looking fine during his years, during the Clinton years. And thankfully, after the Clinton years, we got a real free market president in America by the name of George W. Bush, who said enough is enough. This Social Security program, it is unsustainable and un-American, and I have a plan. I have a coherent strategy to transition out of social... Actually, no, just kidding. George Bush and the Republican Congress would go on to create the largest new entitlement since LBJ by expanding Medicare.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
Although, in all fairness to George W. Bush, I guess he did propose some reforms, again, in the name of preserving Social Security, although those reforms ultimately went nowhere. So anyway, here we are. It's 2023. It's been, what, I think 5 years since the Social Security Administration released a report warning that Social Security would become insolvent. Social Security and Medicare are on track to become insolvent by what? 2033, 2034, 2035. And I'm over here wondering, who's talking about this? Who's thinking about a long-term strategy to avoid this elephant in the room? I mean, outside of Democrats, obviously the Democrats, their solution to everything is more government intervention, more central planning, more taxes, higher taxes. So at best, Democrats are useless.
You're goddamn right.
But what about Republicans? Which Republicans outside of Mike Pension, who I'm going to call Mike Pension because I imagine if he runs for president, this is going to be a focal point of his campaign. This got me thinking, you know, this might be an issue that if Republicans were led by serious people, and if Republicans had their shit together, if they were a party with serious people focused on stuff like economics and free markets, instead of culture wars on behalf of Christian nationalism or some other insane ideology, this could be an issue that they could really cash in on, hone in on, and offer a coherent alternative, a coherent strategy to deal with. And who knows, again, if Mike Pension decides to run for president, even if he does not win, maybe he can at least get Republicans to think seriously about this issue. Because aside from that, even as Mike Pension said, and I agree with this, I know President Trump is a huge fan of Social Security and Medicare, but I don't think even President Trump, former President Trump, has a coherent plan to preserve Social Security long term. And really, why would he? Even if Donald Trump manages to get elected in 2024, he's only going to have 4 years. After 2028, he won't be allowed to run again, in which case this is all going to blow up long after he's out of office. And as I talked about in another video, Nikki Haley is very wishy-washy on the subject. I don't think she has a plan. From what I've seen of Vivek Ramaswamy, he doesn't really talk about Social Security. I'm not sure he has a coherent plan. And on top of that, what are the intellectuals? What's the intellectual landscape on the political right and the conservative commentators? What are they saying about Social Security? Because I don't really see a lot of discussion or concern about Social Security and its potential insolvency. From what I can tell, every conservative commentator, YouTuber, podcaster has around 5 or 6 videos at least about Bud Lights and Miller Lights and other horrible woke corporations. Yeah, all these woke corporations, they're going woke and they're going broke. Yet nobody on the right really seems interested in talking about Social Security going broke and what to do about it. Because everything's about culture wars. And you want to talk about culture wars. You want to talk about politics being downstream from culture. Yeah, conservative culture warriors, they obsess over Bud Light. And now we have politicians like Ted Cruz. Instead of focusing on Social Security going broke, I guess he's focused on investigating Bud Light.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
Yeah, no big deal or anything, though. It's not like the Social Security insolvency issue. It's not like this is going to impact most, if not every American, and it's not like it has implications for the economy and the future of America.